Our next panelist is Robert Popper, who also served a stint in the Civil Rights Division of the Justice Department, including 5 years as the Deputy Chief of the Voting Section. Robert Popper is now the Director of the Election Integrity Project at Judicial Watch. He is conducting an ongoing study to examine the issue of over-registration or inflated voter rolls in all 50 states. Preliminary findings from his project identified approximately 3.5 million more people on voter rolls than are eligible to vote, but I will allow him to describe those results.
Thank you, Mr. Commissioner. Thank you, Commissioners, for having me today. There's been a lot of talk so far today about a lack of confidence in the integrity of American elections, and it's easy to find polls that suggest that that's true. The one I'd like to focus on is a comparative Gallup poll. What they did was they asked countries around the world, citizens in those countries, do you have confidence in the integrity of the elections in your country? And in 2016, before the political conventions that summer, Americans were asked this question, and 69% said no. They did not have confidence. 30% said yes. Now, this number puts the United States 90th out of 112 countries that were polled. And in fact, in those countries that are identified as industrial democracies by Gallup, we are second to last, only ahead of Mexico. And that number, moreover, has been negative for more than the current election cycle, for more than the current set of discussions about American election integrity. It has basically been negative since 2008 in the United States. Americans uniquely in the world don't trust the integrity of their elections, uniquely in industrial democracies. In 2012, there was a groundbreaking study, really, by the Pew Center for the States that first brought to everyone's attention the parlous condition of our nation's voter rolls. That study indicated that 1/8 of all registrations had some sort of major inaccuracy, that there were 1.8 million deceased voters on the rolls, and that there were 2.8 million who were registrants who were registered in more than one state. Now, Judicial Watch hired a demographer and a political scientist to analyze the voter registration rates by county in the United States. And what he did was to compare the Election Assistance Commission's biennial report and registration data with the American Community Survey data on citizens over the age of 18. Now, the ACS survey is an enormous survey, 3.5 million surveys per year. You know, if you compare that to a standard poll, that's simply phenomenal. And it includes citizenship estimates. Now, this was in order to allow us to develop notice letters that we would send to states telling them that we thought that they were failing to comply with the National Voter Registration Act. This was the same process we followed when I was at the Department of Justice. This is how one identifies states that may be falling down in terms of their obligations. Federal courts have routinely recognized that high registration rates are a basis for sending a notice of violation letter under the NVRA. All of that being said, it's not the end of the story. You don't stop with high registration rates. You look beyond them. You understand what's happening. You ask the state to explain it, and you look at their explanation. One example that I have, since I've worked at Judicial Watch, concerns a state that told us they had high registration rates because of their diligent enforcement of the NVRA, which we know requires putting people who have moved or may have moved and don't respond to a confirmation notice on an inactive list for 2 general federal elections. And they said, since we've done that so diligently, we have inflated voter rolls because we have large numbers of inactive registrations. Well, we got their database, which is, and you know, again, people should understand, as someone previously said, how easy it is to get a voter list from a state. I guess easy for anyone but a Presidential Advisory Commission. And you obtain these rolls, you typically can purchase them. And when we made a comparison, we found that they had thousands of registrations that had been in an inactive status for more than 10 years. Okay, those registrations simply cannot be explained by having to wait for 2 general federal election cycles to be completed. In our study, the most recent one for 2017, we found that 17% of the counties where we had enough data to make this comparison, and, responses to the Election Assistance Commission are not uniform. Some counties shirk that duty. It is a federal requirement pursuant to federal regulations, but some counties don't comply. But for the ones where we had data, 17% had registration rates exceeding 100%. That is, they had more registrations than they had eligible citizens over the age of 18. This is an increase from 11% from just 2 years ago. So we perceive that the problem is getting worse. And in a number of these jurisdictions, we contacted the jurisdiction directly to get their number. If we had a question, or even if just if they were large enough, for example, we contacted Los Angeles County directly. And they gave us a number of inactives that was twice what they gave to the Election Assistance Commission, meaning 1.5 to 2 million more inactives than they had reported. And Los Angeles County is obviously not a small county. Now, we heard some testimony today and statements about whether you should count inactives. When you look at a registration rate, you absolutely should. You absolutely should. Any registration that can be voted on Election Day should be counted as part of a state's registration list. And I note that Mr. Brace indicated that in one county, we don't have the nationwide statistics, and we could use them. But in one county, the rate of voting for inactive registrations was 11% in 2014. Well, the national turnout rate in 2014 was 36%. 11% of a significant subpopulation matters. They should be counted. And I also would point out a few other findings that we stumbled across in our study. One was that there are 157 U.S. counties that had more active registrations than the comparator, which is citizens over the age of 18. And so that left out inactive registrations. There are still 157 counties in the red. And finally, I would note that for those who argue that you shouldn't count inactive registrations, we're clean except for our inactive registrations. We hear this, particularly when we send out notice letters. 83% of American counties managed to have registration rates that were less than 100%. And that's less than 100%, including actives plus inactives. If you're one of the 17%, you're still an outlier. It's not explained by the fact that maybe inactive registrations shouldn't count. One other finding, which doesn't have to do with active or inactive registrations, is we found that 15% of those who responded to the EAC did not list any confirmation notices being sent in the last 2-year period. Now, those confirmation notices are how you find out that someone may have moved, and you're asking them their address and you're asking them to get back to you. We don't know if this 15% were simply blowing off their federal obligation to report this data. We don't know if they didn't report it because the number was embarrassingly low, but they didn't report it. And when 11% of the population moves every year, reporting 0 confirmation notices for 2 years does not indicate compliance with the NVRA. Now, at Judicial Watch, it's our view that the Department of Justice has basically stopped enforcing the list maintenance provisions of Section 8 of the NVRA. When I was at the Department of Justice, we started 5 cases in which there was a claim under that statute, and we obtained 3 consent decrees and a settlement agreement out of that process. Since then, no cases have been started by the Department of Justice involving such a claim. None from that date, from the last case that I brought when I was there until today. They have not sent out a notice letter saying that you, state, jurisdiction, county, you are in violation of the NVRA. And it's left to, nonprofits like Judicial Watch and a few other nonprofits around the country to pursue these lawsuits that the Department of Justice should be pursuing. Now, I want to close by telling you that there are good, sound reasons to enforce the NVRA, and when I do this, I want to distinguish the NVRA from the debate over voter ID laws, okay? It's not good enough to just import all your talking points from voter ID laws. Let's talk about fraud. Is there, isn't there? That doesn't work because the NVRA is federal law now. This weighing has already been done by Congress. This law was passed as a compromise bill that guaranteed both access and integrity, and there is something dishonest about enforcing only half of a compromise bill. That is contrary to the congressional intention of those who passed the bill. I would also point out that all kinds of fraud are prevented by complying with the accurate voter list maintenance provisions of the NVRA, that it is broader than voter ID. For example, if you get rid of inaccurate registrations, you put a dent in the ability to double vote. Now bear in mind that with double voting, someone is who they say they are. Voter ID will not catch them if they move to Nevada and vote their California registration and also vote in Nevada. You know, also, the National Voter Registration Act has non-fraud advantages. One of these is for get out the vote efforts and voter education efforts. It costs money to send ballots and registration materials and information to people who no longer live in a state because you got their names off a voter ID list, off a voter registration list that has become invalid. And lastly, I do believe that there is fraud. I think that we have strong suggestive evidence of it. We don't know how much. We cannot right now establish the rate, I think, for most kinds of fraud. All right? But we also know that the information is out there and we ought to get it, and we know that states don't record this data. There was an organization, News 21, that sent public records requests to states asking them, what are your voter fraud rates? And several states, not counties, not just counties, but states said they did not track this kind of fraud. You can understand why if you look into some of the penalties for voter fraud. They are typically light or lighter than a lot of other crimes. For example, in coming here, I looked up the statutes in our neighboring state of Vermont, and what I discovered was that for double voting in a primary or general election, the fine was $1,000, no jail time. For double voting in a local election, the fine was $100, which is, you know, a moving violation, I've heard, and no jail time. But that in Vermont, the penalty for selling maple syrup without a license is $5,000 or up to 1 year in prison. Aside from the data on fraud, there's just a larger point that I'd like to make, and it's simply this. Elections should look clean. Enforcing the NVRA is part of making that true. Elections should look clean. For example, when I was at the Department of Justice, a man showed up with a club at a polling station in Philadelphia. Right? That's against the law. When I was at the Department of Justice monitoring another election in Philadelphia in 2012, there was a floor-to-ceiling mural of President Obama with a quote from his campaign speech on the wall of a polling place at a school. There are laws against electioneering. Now, no one would say that a law against bringing weapons to a polling place should be analyzed in terms of how many people actually were frightened and didn't vote or had their minds changed because he was there. No one would say that a law against electioneering should be judged by how many people saw the mural of President Obama and decided to change their vote. That's not the point. It looks dirty. It suggests to you that your election officials are not going to be impartial because they put this on the wall or allowed it to be there. And you should look at enforcing the NVRA the same way. You know, to the extent that we have 69% of the American people not trusting American elections, enforcing the NVRA, which is current federal law, would be one way to address that. Thank you.